forest geneticist, if they're a forester, they almost ignore the forest part and just focus on the genetics part and then figure I'm just some person in a lab doing genetic stuff. And I'm a forester first and a geneticist second. And while I know how to do molecular work, I'm a very applied person. And so I really appreciate folks like Dana and his colleagues who are doing all that basic research in molecular genetics. But what I want to do is take those tools and apply it to forest management. Okay? Because we can ask questions now that even 5 years ago we would have never been able to ask because we didn't have the tools to answer them. But molecular genetics is a very, very powerful tool, and we understand it enough now that we can use it, and the cost is going down, and we should be using it. So throughout my entire career, I've been kind of on this campaign of don't forget about genetics when we're making silviculture and management prescriptions. So today what I want to do is talk to you about one of the examples where I applied that. So, first off, oh, and by the way, this will probably be the only talk you ever hear that is not about oak from me. And the reason being for that is that this is part of my process for my application to become adjunct faculty here at Kentucky. And so they wanted a research seminar, and while I have a lot of research on white oak, it's not my own, so I wanted to present something that was my own. And it gives us a chance to look at a little different ecosystem this spring compared to most of the other presentations in the seminar series this spring. So we're going to go out west, and we're going to look at ponderosa pine, and because it is a little bit different ecosystem, not all of you might be familiar with, just a little bit of background here. And so, again, if you're a splitter, taxonomic splitter, there's 4 subspecies of ponderosa pine. If you're a lumper, we're going to put these two together, the blue and yellow, and call it variety scopulorum, and put the red and green together and call it variety ponderosa. I'm going to be talking about variety scopulorum today. So, first off, a little bit of background in terms of why restoration was needed in the Southwest. So that tree is this tree. Keep your eyes on the background here. That stump is this stump. That post is this post. And that clump is that. So basically 1941, 2003, 1923, 2005. Notice the pretty overgrazed scenario here. Some other pictures. Keep your eyes on these 2 trees. This is what it looked like in 1909. This is what it looked like in 1949. A little bit different angle. This is what it looked like in 2003. Again, keep your eye on the background. So, what caused all this? First off, ponderosa pine produces abundant seed, but has very, very dry summers in that part of the world. It's considered a semi-arid ecosystem, and most of the germinating seedlings die. However, there was an unusually sort of series of wet summers in 1918, 1920, right in that area, time span. So the germinating seedlings survived. Normally, wildfire would have taken them out, grass competition would have taken a lot of them out, but because we were overgrazing by cattle and sheep during that time, the grass competition was gone, so a large number of seeds that germinated, the seedlings survived, and then when you layer on fire suppression, we end up with a lot of trees. So this is, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these dendrochronology records that look just like this. Fire, 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 stop. And they all stop at the same time. And it's very distinctive. And basically, it was when our fire suppression tools became very handy. World War II, World War I and II ended, okay? Planes, bombers were refitted to drop fire retardant, so they got really good at putting out fires. So those of you that don't know, so each line represents an increment core, and each little tick represents a fire. Most fires move the same way in a particular geographic region, so they're always going to hit that cat face, that cat scar, the same way. So you have this continuous record. And the nice thing about out west is it's warm, but there isn't enough moisture for a lot of decomposition. So the records stay intact for a long, long time. We have some records that go back for long times. This illustrates that change in tree density. So notice the green background, the scale is 0 to 6,000 trees per acre. Notice the pink is 0 to 20 trees per acre. So this pink part is basically along this line. So basically our maximum was about 20 trees per acre. And then notice again at the same time, fire suppression, all those other things, so all that germinating seedlings, okay? Then you have this huge, huge jump in the number of trees per acre. So, again, another good, these are historical photos, that's why the color is a little different, but that tree there is the same tree here, is the same tree here. And again, you can just see those changes, it's very, very obvious. So, are the changes good or not? Well, if we look at areas, particularly like the north rim of the Grand Canyon, it was too hard to get to. So it's too hard to get to for livestock, too hard to get to put out fires. So the disturbance regime and the grasses and everything stayed pretty intact. So we have areas like that throughout northern Arizona that were used as reference conditions. So compared to those, okay, those forests have really low herbaceous cover. They've lost plant and animal diversity. Obviously, you've seen the photos of these eruptions of tree populations, high water stress in these. And there's only so much water, and it's being divided up amongst all these trees. And so what happens is these trees are so water stressed, and I've measured water stress. I've measured a water potential on some of these trees. You know, it's kind of scary that your pressure chamber is going up and up and up and up and up. You're like, ooh, this kind of could explode maybe. So the trees don't actually have enough resin to pitch out bark beetles. So now you have these bark beetle eruptions that are also well outside the range of natural variability. Along with that, then all of a sudden it's, you know, old trees should die, okay, but we're seeing an increased rate of death. And then there's a shift from what was a surface fire regime to crown fires that burn at very high intensities. So just to give you some more examples, this is the Gus Pearson Natural Area, Fort Valley Experimental Station. So back in 1876, the green was ponderosa pine, the yellow was herbaceous. Notice how little we have left here, and then in 1990, those are all the other different sizes of ponderosa pine. Now, while I'm on the slide, I'll give a little history lesson here. So in the early 1900s, the Reardon brothers were loggers in the Flagstaff area. And they were really worried about harvesting and not seeing any regeneration coming back in. So this was before all the eruption of the trees, right? So their good friend, Frederick Law Olmsted, they asked him about it. He said, well, you know, who you need to talk to is Gifford Pinchot, who was also one of their friends. And so Gifford Pinchot, and what they said was, we need some kind of structured experiment here to look at, to develop silvicultural prescriptions for regenerating the southwestern ponderosa pine ecosystem. And so Raphael Zahn, Gifford Pinchot sent Raphael Zahn out, and he met up with Gustav Pearson, who was a forester out in the area north of Flagstaff. And they established the very first Forest Service experimental station. And that was established in 1908, and they actually put in some research plots in 1909. And there aren't a lot of very nice things about hantavirus, but one of the good things kind of was when the hantavirus happened, all the really old historic buildings at Fort Valley had to be cleaned out. And in the process, they found handwritten records. And Gus Pearson, he was probably a hard person to work for because he was so incredibly detailed. This is actually to scale. He actually did things like this to scale. So this is what he created, and then this is what they recreated in 1990. He mapped individual bunch grasses. They're called the Woolsey plots. which are historic. If you ever travel from Flagstaff to Phoenix, there's a bend in Interstate 17. And that actually goes, they had, by law, Arizona DOT had to go around the Woolsey plots because they were considered historic. So sometimes our science wins out over policies. So this is northern the Grand Canyon. This is one of our, these are people, okay? Look at how tall the grass is, notice the clumpy structure. When this burns, it burns like this, okay? Today, we call these dog-hair thickets because the trees are as thick as dog hair on a dog, okay? They burn like this. So this is a Rodeo Sky fire. It was a fire complex, came together, 468,000 plus acres, and you could actually see the burn spot from space. You can see the mushroom. So Flagstaff is right here where the blue is. It's the Humphreys Peak with snow on it. So from there you can see the mushroom cloud of this fire. So the goal of restoration in this ecosystem is to use these reference conditions to restore composition, structure, and function of the evolutionary environment. So me, being a geneticist, I'm like, okay, evolutionary, that's genetics, right? It's the last time you ever hear genetics referred to in any ecological restoration. I used to go to the Society for Ecological Restoration meetings, no genetics at that time, okay? So I'm like, what, but. So it became part of my mission to say, what about genetics? And I nagged long enough that I finally got enough and wrote enough proposals, I finally got one funded, which is what this research was based on. So again, the idea here is it's 5,800 trees per acre. So that's what 5,800 trees per acre looks like. Average DBH is only 2.5 inches, almost no understory, okay? We want to take it back to something like this. So all of the different sites they looked at, basically an average of 60 trees per acre, although they did find some 8, and a maximum of 262 trees per acre in these ecosystems in areas, again, that had a undisturbed fire regime and no overgrazing by livestock. So that's what they're trying to do, is take this to a situation that looks like that. So here's an example of a Woolsey plot, just because I brought it up earlier. And you can still find these today. So this is actually this tree, and that is that stump, and this is this stump. They were mapped so precisely by Gus Pearson and his colleagues that we know exactly what these sites look like. So here's logs, here's bunch grasses. We didn't even know how long a bunch grass lived, but we can find the same bunch grass on the landscape. So we know they live a lot longer than we thought. All right, so it's an example of what a prescription does, and essentially what they do is they remove all the post-fire suppression trees except those that are needed to replace an old stump. So what that would look like is, so if you're sitting on a cloud looking down at the tops of the forest, those blobs are the tree crowns. That's what it looked like in 1876. Notice all the little white stuff, all those trees filled in 1992. So a full restoration would take it back to this. And again, some of these smaller trees they're leaving to replace stumps. So this is Gus Pearson, experimental forest now, natural area. The back is unrestored. Notice it's solid wall of trees. The foreground is restored. Now the trees are restored. The understory, the herbaceous layer is not restored, and that's actually a subject of a whole nother seminar. So these replacement trees, I want to talk about them because it's a little controversial about how many to leave. So typically they leave on average 1.5, I know you can't have 1.5 trees, but on average 1.5 to 3 trees per stump. So here's an old stump, and they would leave this tree and that tree. They try to pick out sort of big, healthy trees to replace that stump, figuring at least one of the trees will survive and be a replacement for that stump. So, well, some of the controversy associated with ecological restoration out west by some of the more activist groups was restoration is just an excuse for logging. We don't want this clumpy structure. They like more trees, okay? So they wanted more trees left. And just kind of an aside, I thought, so the Ecological Restoration Institute has a similar structure to the Forest Health Center here, where they have economists and social science folks, as well as foresters. And so what they did is they put the different groups into what they wanted, right? And then they said, okay, you develop your prescription here, and we will harvest it the way you want it, and here and here. So they created all these plots, set them on fire. So it's pretty cool. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. But it was really cool, because this way folks could actually see what they wanted would look like when fire came. All right, so the genetic questions that I had for this. Did the older and younger trees differ? So pre and post fire. Because if you're eliminating all of by eliminating all those post-fire trees, you're assuming they have no genetic value. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's true. The clumpy structure. Again, most of the general public's perception, they actually like sort of the regularly spaced, more plantation-ish looking, maybe not quite that regularly spaced, but they like lots of trees. To them was more healthy, appeared more healthy than this clumpy structure. So wanted to think about this clumpy structure a little bit. If it has a genetic basis to it, then that's the evolutionary trajectory thing. So we need to create those clumps. And then looking at the way they were leaving the trees, how is that influencing or affecting sort of this restoration of clumpy structure? And then how does that really extensive thinning, so going from this scenario to this scenario, how does that affect genetic diversity in your populations? So I'm going to sweep through the methods pretty quickly here, because that's usually, especially in genetics, where people sort of start glazing over. I'm not going to show you any gels. But the paper was published a couple years ago in New Forest, so if you're really interested, you can find a lot of the details there, or you can ask me about it. So we had 5 different sites. We sampled about 24 trees per population. Okay, I'll talk about that in a moment. And then, so there are basically 4 populations that we looked at. We looked at the old trees. We looked at the young trees. We looked at sort of randomly selected versus trees that were around in a stump. And then we used all of our young trees, so the post-fire suppression trees, and we couldn't really cut. So what we did is we just computerized, simulated randomly removing 50%, 75%. Keep in mind that full restoration removes 90 to 95%. So we were well below actually what was removed. And so this is kind of a cartoonish look at what the experimentally design looked like. Collected about 5 to 10 vegetative buds. My poor graduate student, so there's Eddie Bressler, is very good with his rifle. Of course, way easier to shoot. Ponderosa pine limbs are fat, especially in the Southwest, compared to white oaks. And there's Christian there. She's awesome with the pole printer. So we collected our buds, and I decided to use allozyme. So whenever we're trying to decide to use genetics to help us with a management problem, it's very important to think about the tool that you select, because different tools, molecular tools, have very different advantages and disadvantages. So I decided to choose allozymes because that's a product of your DNA. So, but they vary genetically. So, so like a dehydrogenase enzyme, there's multiple versions of that look slightly differently genetically. And so we can use that to look at variation. It's a very conservative tool. So what I mean by that is, if you find variation, it's real. Okay? Some of our other techniques will generate a lot of variation. So like there are some genetic techniques that can't tell a white oak from a chestnut oak, for example. So again, I chose a conservative tool because I wanted to know if it's there, I want to be really confident that it is true genetic differences. So we looked at a loci. So remember, loci is just a place on your DNA where a gene is. Looked at 15 enzyme systems. Only 11 of those were variable. The rest were the same, so we ignore those and we just work with those. And then worked over at NFGEL, so the National Forest Genetics Electrophoresis Lab in Placerville, California. Basically, if you pay for supplies, but they do the work for free. Of course, I made my graduate students go there and help them. It's a really great facility. It's over close to 80 years old now, and they have places for the students to stay, and it's a really cool place. So they went over there, did the work there. They only work on problems on the national forest, so this is actually a lab dedicated to problems on our national forests. And then we analyze them using all the basic genetic stuff. All right, so let's get to the good stuff. So, comparing basically pre and post, or the old versus the young, so the young versus our old trees, were they different? Okay, so don't worry about all those different parameters. So things, they're basically our genetic parameters that we use to look at diversity were all the same. Okay, but notice our trees here, so our post-fire, the young trees definitely are different. We back up just a second. So basically the average age of our old trees was 236 years, post-fire 73 years. The DBH of the old trees, 23 inches, and the young trees about 8. So these are heterozygosity values, so expected and observed. So notice our observed is less than expected, which means that things are more similar than they are different. Okay? So this suggests inbreeding is happening, which is what this value also is telling us. This is basically the number of alleles per loci. So you have a gene for hair color, but then you have alleles that say what color your hair will be. And if you remember from biology, you have 2 alleles for each loci. But when I look at the population in here, there could be many, many, many alleles for hair color, even though each one of us only has 2. Okay? So that's what we're looking at here, is the number of alleles per loci. And again, how many of the loci are polymorphic, which means you have a big B and a little b for a trait, if you remember from biology. All right, so notice that our post-fire is a little bit more diverse than our old traits. So all of the values over here, even though they weren't statistically significant, they are showing an increase. The only one that's a decrease is the inbreeding. So this was actually more, the old trees were actually more inbred, so more alleles in common than the young trees. So what differed? Allele frequencies were different, and we can calculate how much genetic distance there is between 2 groups. And I know this number looks small, but DNA is small, but this is actually a relatively big number. So this is actually just as big of a number as the distance between variety scopularum and variety ponderosa, for example. Okay? Now, allele frequencies are important. Just in case you don't remember your freshman biology, okay? When we see changes in allele frequencies, usually that means something is happening, and that something quite often is selection. So is the peppered moth in Great Britain. The white form is right here. You can barely see it, okay? So the more dark you had, so if you had alleles that said make more dark color, you were easy to be picked off the trees, and you were preyed upon. So the dark alleles kind of stayed at only very low levels in the population of peppered moths. Then the Industrial Revolution came. There was a lot of soot and pollution. The lichens, which is what were white, okay? Lichens are very sensitive to pollution. They died. So now all of a sudden, you're on the darker bark, and if you're white, you show up. So now, the more alleles that you had that said make dark color increased in the population, and the moths look like this. And then they had an equivalent of our Clean Air Act. The lichens rebounded. And the only reason why the peppered moth didn't go extinct is because there were still enough alleles in these that said make light color, so it was able to go back that way. So it's kind of an extreme example, but I pulled it up to show you that allele frequency differences matter. So the fact that allele frequencies vary between the old and the young trees is actually quite important. All right, now let's look at the, actually, go back a moment. So why might these differ? Look at this evolution, look at this density-dependent competition environment here, and compare that to this density-dependent competition. So the selective pressures were very, very different. And so the allele frequencies is probably the main reason why we have different allele frequencies between these two populations, were the selective pressures. And this, everyone thinks evolutionary happens slowly over time. Selection happens immediately. And you can change allele frequencies immediately in one generation. That's essentially what we're seeing here. So by removing all of these trees, okay, we may be losing alleles that perhaps we don't want to be. And to be perfectly honest, if you can survive in this situation, kind of a super competitor, and we might want those alleles in our contemporary forests as they deal with the stresses with climate change and everything else. All right, so now about the clumpy structure, okay? So again, the genetic diversity between the clumps and within the clumps was the same, but genetic diversity was lower within our clumps, okay? So again, I just picked randomly selected old trees and then we compared them to the trees inside the clumps. And this just shows you that there's genetic structure. What that means is the genetics of a clump here differs from this clump, from this clump, from this clump. Okay. And then this is a relatively high value of inbreeding, so trees within a clump are more related to each other than between clumps. Okay. And that's kind of what this says. So the idea here is that pollen moves by wind. Okay, so there was really good pollen exchange. When you have really good pollen exchange, you shouldn't see these numbers happening. But ponderosa pine seed has wing on it. It's wind dispersed, but it's pretty heavy seed, so it doesn't go very far. So it actually a secondary, just very important secondary dispersal agent, or scatter hoarder, or seed caching, rodents and birds. So they would take a bunch of seed, not just one, but a bunch, right? And then they hide it, they bury it. And they don't always re-find it. And so if weather conditions are good, you have a new clump starts. But since most of those seeds came from pretty much the same pine cone, they're all half siblings to each other. So the fathers may differ, but the mother is the same. So the clumps are basically genetic neighborhoods, what we call a genetic neighborhood. So the individuals are more closely related within the clump than between. I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's the way nature designed that. And if we're going to restore to this evolution, and remember, full restoration is a 90% or more removal, and we just looked at 50 and 75. So again, this is about a 90% removal here. So taking a look here, okay, what's really important again are down here. So this is your total number of alleles. And notice it's going down, okay? But notice our other genetic parameters were also going down as well. So genetic diversity, as you might expect, from the unthinned population to a 50 to a 75% thin is going down. I didn't do 90 because we didn't have enough, our overall sample size was too small, so by the time you got down to 90%, wasn't really very many trees, so we didn't feel that that was very valid. So again, this is the key. This, as well as these two values, predict, they are quantitative estimates, but they basically tell you about how well that stand could respond to change. So we don't want to see it going down, because if those values go down, it means that the stand's ability to respond to change is going down, primarily because you're losing alleles. So notice that in terms of total alleles out there, so if I looked at all of the alleles in this room, okay, it actually went down 70% with the 75% thinning. If we look at this theoretical number of how many genotypes, individual genetic makeups could you get for a given number of alleles, so that's what this GM is. So huge numbers, of course, because you can create a lot of, remember meiosis from biology, you can create a lot of genotypes if you look at all the alleles. So this is 10 to the 9th, or 10 to the 8th, and a smaller 10 to the 8th number there. So the number of total genotypes goes down. And then your latent genetic potential, again, this is the degree at which a stand can adapt evolutionarily, also goes down, big jump, 0.05 and 0.01. So it matters. So the thinning did matter. All right, so just to review our message here, there are differences between the pre-fire suppression and post-fire suppression populations. Clumps matter. Evolution, we don't know what it means, but from an evolutionary standpoint, there was a genetic structure to that. And we may not be conserving allelic richness when we're doing those really heavy thinning. All right, so what do you think? So when I shared this with the rest ponderosa, what do you think the first thing they asked me was, so how many trees should we leave? Right. All right, so that's right. So we can do this. But again, my goal is to take the next step. Because this doesn't do a silviculturist or forest manager any good in this form. So we need to put it into reality. So here's just 3 examples of those plots. Remember I said that were created and we set them on fire. This is burn only, not so good, right? That's a little scary. That's a little scary. We have a lot of fire people around that one. Full restoration. This is what the ecological restorationists want. But remember, this is not necessarily conserving genetic diversity. And then we kind of have a minimal thinning, which is a little scary. Okay, so probably what we want is something between here and here. Okay, but still, something between here and here doesn't tell the silviculturist and forest managers enough information. So, let's get to some specifics then. So here are 3 different restoration treatments. They're actually on the ground. This is full restoration, this is leaving a little bit more trees, and this is leaving a little bit more trees. Notice they are pruned to try to avoid our fire ladder situation there. So leave more than 1 to 3 replacement trees per stump. That's one of the ways to restore clumpy structure that will have the genetic makeup that you want. You don't need a lot, I'm talking 4 to 5 instead of 1 to 3. Vary your thinning intensity across the landscape. So we definitely don't want these crown fires, okay? So we don't want this everywhere, and maybe we don't want this everywhere, but nature doesn't like it to be super uniform. So let's vary our thinning intensities across the landscape, and that way you'll be able to maintain your allelic diversity across the landscape. And basically, again, just don't thin as much. So folks that have studied this suggest you need about 1,000 interbreeding individuals to conserve genetic diversity. So if you look at a 5-hectare, it's like 12 acres, okay, or about 81 trees per acre, you could achieve this 1,000 trees to maintain your genetic health. Okay, so how many trees should you leave? 81, counting the big trees. All right, so if you only have like 23 of the big trees per acre, you can add in the others to come close to this 81. And of course, different spots you might have more than 81, different spots you might have less. And again, you want to recreate, you want to restore the clumps. Now what's pretty cool is that when they actually went out on the landscape to see the actual restoration that was happening out there, they're actually at this. Because what happened was, this is just not acceptable to the general public. Okay? General public wants to see, even though this is healthy, we know this is healthy, general public wants to see bigger trees and more of them. So to get public acceptance of restoration on public lands, the restorationists were actually not exactly following the restoration guidelines. They were actually leaving more trees because that was, you could get past the lawsuits that way and you could actually get real work done. And, a lot of times the fighting is over 12 versus a 16-inch tree, So, so this is the number. So this is how then I suggested that they modify their silviculture prescriptions for restoration in the southwestern ponderosa pine ecosystem. So an example, this is the Flagstaff urban wildland interface. Okay, so we call it food. 1876, it had 23 trees per acre. This is in 1993. That tree there is this tree here. At 1,252 trees per acre. The fire folks here, that's 21 tons of fuel per acre. That makes the Flagstaff people really, really, really nervous. Flagstaff actually burned down completely twice. They almost never rebuilt it, but they decided to. So post-restoration, it's about 4 years after restoration, and it's at about 60 trees per acre. So we're above our 23. We're not really quite to 81. But again, this is the forest sprouting Flagstaff, so they went a little bit more intense of a setting. And then finally, I want to end on this slide, because this slide, the message of this slide is science works. So here's an unrestored area. Here's a restored area. A whole bunch of us had research plots in here. And this area was slated to be restored. But lightning beat us to it and started a very intense crown fire. It's generating its own weather, so it's too windy for the planes to go up for the fire retardant drop. It was too windy for the helicopters to go up for water drops. Fire guys are like, sorry man, nothing we can do. So the nice thing about Arizona is you can see really far. So we're all kind of sitting on a mesa watching this fire. It's going to burn down. Millions of dollars of research. And it gets up here, and there's a little fire line here, but it gets up here. Fire lines like this don't stop. Dog here to take a fire. And it gets in here a little bit. You can see the foliage dying here. And then it drops to the ground. And starts burning like a low intensity surface fire. And we all just sat there going, it worked. It works. It really works. Ecological restoration, according to what folks came up with, worked. So anytime I'm like, oh, it's going to be like 1,000, I'll never see the fruits of the labor of the White Oak Genetics Project, but I can always keep in mind, it's like, science works, management works, silviculture works, and we can restore health to our forests. So with that, my 2 graduate students, Kristen and Eddie, lots of thanks. The Rocky Mountain Research Station funded a lot of this work. Of course, the Genetics Lab and the Ecological Restoration Institute helped out a lot with this project, and I've got plenty of time for questions. This is usually the response when I'm giving sort of geneticists in the crowd will always ask. Yeah.
All right, so there's a growing interest in assisted migration, moving species kind of maybe even within the range and beyond the range. So what can we learn from this as kind of to help inform those types of movements? Do you have any kind of guiding thoughts? Or
the healthier, so the more resistant and resilient, which are the 2 main goals that we're trying to do when we restore, is put resistance and resilience back in. So I want to have a really healthy forest. So these have more water available to them. They are resistant and resilient to disturbances. So as stress to changing climates come in, okay, you're not going to just see wholesale death, because hopefully, again, if we have genetic diversity in here, and assuming temperatures don't change beyond the limits of ponderosa pine, which probably won't because it goes all the way down into northern Mexico. So if there are alleles here, those are the offspring that are going to survive. So in this particular situation, because it's almost a continuous population of trees, all the way from northern Mexico all the way up to Canada, okay? If pollen can move the way it should, and we have healthy forests, In this particular scenario, we probably don't have to step in and help. If we do, we can certainly move trees from south to north. But I would argue, again, if we've done a really good job with restoration, we may not have to, because they may have the genetic tools within them. And that's why that latent genetic potential is so important to maintain and not to go down. So, good question. Other species, it's a whole different scenario, where populations of the tree species, where there are gaps between them and things like that. So in there, we may have to physically move species. But this case is a little bit unique, and I think it's going to be easier for us, assuming they don't burn up. So, one of the problems with changing climates is the fire behavior, fire season is changing, right? So that's even more of a push to get these forests restored, because fire will just stay on the surface. Now we did learn, we did learn that around some of the really, really old trees, we actually go in and you make lots of labor, for lots of student labor. I actually make little fire lines around those because of fire suppression, the duff layer had gotten so thick up against the tree that it's like charcoal, when it turns white, like old-fashioned charcoal, right? It turns white, which is really when it's the hottest. And it just sat there and smoldered up against the really, really, really old trees. And it burned into it didn't start the tree on fire, but the heat actually worked its way slowly through that really thick bark, fire-adapted bark, and it burned the cambium. And so we started to see the old trees die. So until everything gets situated, the really old trees are going to save, actually, there's space around them. A little side note there. Yeah, Tyler.
So you have 5 hectares there for your neighborhood size of interbreeding trees. I was just kind of curious how you came up with 5 hectares. I mean, in some systems, pollen clouds move vast distances. In some, it doesn't move very far.
Right. Well, so this was just kind of based on very average across the landscape. So some of the neighborhoods where you would have pollen movement, so this is about as far as pollen's going to move in ponderosa pine, would be across that distance. Mainly, I mean, if there was nothing in between, it could probably move longer, but it's hitting other stuff. So that was about as far as it could move, and then you would have different size clumps sort of scattered throughout that 12 acres. Does that answer your question? It's highly theoretical, but at least it allowed us to come up with a number to give. Wendy?
Once you've restored these areas, do they require continued management?
Nope, that's the goal, is let nature, and they do now. And that's actually what we learned on that last slide, is that it works. Fire behaves the way it's supposed to. Now, big problem is the herbaceous understory is not restored in these forests. And again, that's a whole, actually, another seminar, because they were violating all kinds of genetic things by aerial spraying seed that was nowhere close to being locally adapted to the areas. So that's actually a problem. They thought they could use the seed bank, but it's been so long that there's no seed left in those. So they have a lot of work, I think, still left to, and I argue for actually, so a bunch grass is cool, so you can pull it apart and plant a bazillion. So just plant some bunch grasses and help it get going. But yeah, once it's restored, that's the nice thing here, is that you can walk away at that point, and fire will behave the way it's supposed to. Sometimes trees will burn up, but you won't have stands that will burn up. Good question.
I answered my own question.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
So explain that a little bit more for a minute, because I thought that it was the bunch grasses that were actually serving as the fuel that carries fire through those stands, and so without that, how does fire act normally? I'm confused by that.
Well, there's Kentucky bluegrass that was brought in for the cattle. So there actually is a lot of Kentucky bluegrass out there. So the bunch grasses, you're right, that is what was supposed to carry the fires. And a lot of these, so what they do is they sow seed, all right? And so they kind of have this continuous, I was trying to get them to sow, which is a little scary, but basically exotic, invasive, sterile biennials. What that means is invasive plants, right, can capture a site takeover really quickly. Great. It's kind of what we want to sort of protect that, right, until we can restore that actual native. Biennial means the first year it's vegetative, second year it produces seed, but because they're sterile, the seed's empty. So that buys you 2 years to go collect seed, grow grasses, which produce seed, and then you can either sow seed or you can plant grass seedlings as bunch grasses and try to get that bunch grass recreated. So that is a piece that they're, but at least in the meanwhile, until they get that done, you're still not having entire stands burned down because the fire still stays. And there's still enough light fuel and stuff, residual fuel, pine needles and stuff on the forest floor. Right now, that's pretty much what's carrying the fire. And it can be, you know, because again, stuff just doesn't decay out west. Very, well, it does, but very slowly. And so you can have pretty thick duff layers. So for now, that's what's carrying the fire until they can get the bunch grass ecosystem, which is pretty labor intensive, but if they want full restoration, that's really what they need to do. Great question, thanks. Anything else? Yeah.
Excuse me. How hopeful are you that large areas can actually be restored, given obviously timber markets are a little bit more of a challenge down in the Southwest, and we put a lot of money into restoration efforts, and a lot of federal money goes towards firefighting instead of actually restoration. I know that's a big challenge.
So, fortunately, you can hide ecological restoration in fuels reduction programs, which is what they do. That's a large part of what is funding ecological restoration. They don't say ecological restoration. It's fuels reduction programs, because people are pretty afraid of fire these days, especially out west, because we've all seen what's happening. So they hide it under that. There's been a couple acts of Congress. Bush passed one that kind of put extra money there for fuels reduction programs. So a lot of it's done that way. And there is the economists at the Ecological Restoration Institute have been working really, really, really hard, because essentially there is no market for thousands and thousands. I mean, you're right, you're looking at, what was that number, 2,000 trees per acre that are like this big. There's no market for them. So some of the things I've been trying to do for some of the little bit bigger sized, so white people came in and, you know, decided to tell Navajo and all the other tribes out there how they should live their lives, and brought in all these super ugly trailers. So there's actually been a push, especially with Navajo, to get rid of the trailers and to go back to the hogans. So there's a big hogan building effort that's working to use a lot of the small diameter stuff. A lot of the small diameter stuff, they were sort of piling and burning it, but that has negative impacts toward carbon in the air, so we don't really want to do that. There's a really cool firm from, I think it was from Sweden, and they came in and they created a mill just outside of Flagstaff. And I don't know enough about the wood properties to explain how it works, but you know, like the little Debbie rolls, right? You can unroll them if you're playing with your food, right? So this mill unrolls a tree, these little tiny trees. And then they alternate the direction that the fibers are, and they create engineered wood. And so that's been actually a really great, I mean, they can't go too little, obviously, but there's a minimum diameter, I don't know what it is. But that's been really great, because again, especially like northern Arizona, a lot of places out west, it just doesn't pay to get these to a mill, and there aren't any mills hardly anymore. Even, there was one paper making mill, but ponderosa pine doesn't make good paper. So, especially toilet paper, you don't want to use ponderosa pine. Maybe newsprint, maybe craft paper, but yeah. So yeah, the markets are an issue, and how do you pay the loggers also? Because you don't want to do everything on federal dollars. And so that's why the restorationists were trying to let the loggers, so loggers were basically harvesting all the little tiny stuff for free, as long as they could take enough big stuff to pay their bills. And again, you're talking a 12 versus a 16-inch log, and that's where all the fights were about, was that occasional 16-foot log that would make it pay for it. But other than those two products, there's not a lot, but a lot of people are working on it, but it is a unique situation because distance to a mill is too far to make it work out economically. Although Williams is in a really good location for that mill that I was describing. And they will have material for many, many years. You know, the life of a mill isn't super long, just because it starts to get too far to bring your material in. But there are a lot of small diameter logs. So basically, Hogan building and then the engineered wood were two of the main products that they were working on.
All right, well, that's all the questions. Thanks very much, Laura.
Thanks, you guys.